Yeah, so to start with, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm presenting this from Warruwi Land, where the Warruwi language belongs. And I'd like to acknowledge any Indigenous participants in the course, and also the lands on which different participants are on. So just to give you a bit of an outline of the class. So we'll start with a bit of a getting to know you activity, and then I'm going to introduce multilingualism, and then we'll talk about language ecologies and linguistic repertoires, and we'll do a activity in pairs in breakout rooms during that part. Then we'll have a half-hour break when you can also stick around and chat and ask questions. And then Jill's going to take over for the second half and get into language ideologies and language practices, talk about ethnography and social categories, and then tie everything neatly together. So because there's so many people here, which is great to see, we thought just as a getting to know you activity, people could introduce themselves in the chat. And now I've forgotten what we said we would post. Jill, maybe you remember. If you want to just say what institution or organisation you're affiliated with, why you're interested in multilingualism, and what was the third one?
I think that was the main stuff. That's enough.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add?
You could say what course you're doing, I guess, if you're studying. Yeah. All right. So me and Jill are also going to introduce ourselves. So I thought I'd just tell you a bit about my research. So I work on Indigenous Australian languages in general, but specifically in West Arnhem Land, and specifically looking at multilingualism. So in the areas of, also work in the area of language documentation, documenting the Maung language and Gunbalang, and doing analyses of Maung in various areas. And I've also been working recently in language and Indigenous education, decolonizing approaches to linguistics, and just other things such as filmmaking with young people. So I just put a couple of my recent publications there, just so you can get an idea of what kind of things I've been doing. So I guess all this work that I've been doing for the last 20 years has been in a context of a research partnership with Warruwi community, which is a small community of a few hundred people in West Arnhem Land. So these are just some pictures of various projects which encompass both, I guess, straightforward research projects and also language and arts and cultural maintenance projects, which are directed more at community goals rather than research goals. So I'll hand it over to Jill.
Hello, everyone. So my research in terms of multilingualism is quite overlapping with Ruth's, in that we work in a similar region in Arnhem Land, but my work in the last 5 years has really hinged on this idea of the sociolinguistics of multilingualism. And so there's an Australian focus, but also my background is from my PhD is looking at the Irish language and looking at the function of the Irish language in different parts of Ireland, but also across the Irish diaspora. So kind of a language and migration theme, but more recently looking at multilingual practices, particularly looking at code switching in the Northern Australian context, some work on language variation within one particular variety in Northern Australia called Barada, and also some work on language in the classroom, both in terms of research on translanguaging, things like that, but also some outreach work with the Linguistics Roadshow and OSCLO, things like that. And as I say, recently really focused on the Arnhem Land region, particularly a community called Maningrida in North Central Arnhem Land, which we'll hear a bit more about in a little while. Some recent publications on the right, so multilingualism, also some interest in youth language practices, code switching, things like that. And just a little plug for particularly relevant publication right down the bottom there that Ruth and I co-wrote on Indigenous multilingualisms past and present. That was an introductory article to a special issue that we co-edited. So I'm going to cover a lot of similar ground today. And you can go on to the next slide, Ruth. And all of this work is absolutely fundamentally based in the collaborations I've been very fortunate to have in Maningrida in recent years. So the photos on the left here are some scenes from an ELDP funded documentation project looking at the Barada dialects. So you can see here doing some transcription with Doreen, who is a speaker of the Anbara Barada dialect, and at the bottom left, Cindy, who works at the Lura language and culture team, who you can see in the photo here at the school in Maningrida, and she's interviewing her mother, who is a senior knowledge holder of that dialect, about some language ideologies behind how we divide up the Barada sociolinguistic space. More recently, I've been doing some work with the Bapara Women's Centre and Maningrida Arts and Culture, doing some really fun documentation of artists' stories across several local languages, looking at narratives about clan and country and dreamings and how they feature in artworks. So Maningrida is really known for incredible artworks, incredible bark painting, sculpture work, weaving, and so on. And so we've been recording those narratives of the stories behind those artworks. I think that's all. Back to you, Ruth.
Alrighty, great. I've just been enjoying reading everyone's introductions. It's really interesting to read about it, and I feel like, you know, if it wasn't for the pandemic, we probably would have met at one conference or another, or visiting each other's departments. So it's good to be able to have a little bit of interaction here, and hopefully those of you I don't know meet face to face sometime. So yeah, I'm just going to introduce multilingualism a bit. Some of this stuff will be very familiar to you, but I guess it also sort of frames the way Jill and I approach multilingualism. As this map shows, Australia is a place where there's many different languages associated with often quite small areas of land, particularly up in the north, in the top end where Jill and I work. So one of the key things is that in many areas of Australia, there's an indirect relationship between people and their language. So the language is not seen so much as just belonging to a group of people, but belonging to an area of land. And so the way that people have a connection to that language is through owning that land. So especially in Arnhem Land where we work, languages are seen to be owned, and you own a language because you own that land. And as this diagram shows, you own land through being part of a clan who owns that land. So they're sort of owned collective, the land's owned collectively, and then the language that belongs to that land is owned by those people. But what this means in Western Arnhem Land is that different groups own the same language, because the areas which are associated with each language are larger than the areas that each clan owns. So this is, yeah, the first point I think I've already made, that language ownership comes from this relationship between language, land, and identity. And linguistic diversity plays an important role in the social world, alongside variation in cultural life. So for example, ownership of different song sets by different groups, artistic life, and ceremonial practice. So these kind of differences, as Peter Sutton have said, are not just incidental, but they're important to how society is structured. So multilingualism, speaking different languages, allows you to connect with all different people. So it has a practical use, but also has an aesthetic value. And it's drawn on in a lot of these artistic activities. So in terms of how people use languages in the Australian context, there's three main ways in which you might find more than one language being used in a single conversation. So I've just referred to these as modes. So a monolingual mode is where you might have two people each speaking the same language, and they each stick to this one language for the whole conversation. Now, this may be the result of linguistic accommodation. So one person might be using a different language to the one they might use in other circumstances because they know that the other person speaks that language and understands it. Or it might be the language that both people prefer to use in most contexts. Anyway, the receptive multilingual mode is similar in that each person sticks to one language for the most part, but they each stick to a different language. So in this case, each person prefers to use a different language, but they know the other person can understand it. So then they just stick with that language. So this has been recorded across Indigenous Australia, even around Sydney by the earliest settlers. But it's very common among speakers of small languages in Arnhem Land. And so it's very common at Warruwi, where a small language, Maung, is seen as the main language. The other mode is code switching. This is where one person uses more than one language. So they're in the conversation, one person is moving between more than one language. Either at the start of a new conversational turn, they might change languages, or at the start of a new clause, or even in the middle of a clause or a word. So one of the things that seems to be the case in Arnhem Land is that there's a tendency to avoid mixing Indigenous languages, particularly within the clause. So there's restrictions which seem to be related to formality of style, where mixing languages is not seen aesthetically as the best way to use language. So there seems to be less restriction on mixing English into Indigenous languages though. And so Jill's done quite a bit of work on that. That mixing English in with Indigenous language is not subject to the same restrictions and can be part of quite a formal style of speaking. So these are sort of ideals, and it's not the case that every conversation falls just into one mode. People might also move between modes. So I've got one example of conversation which one person sticks to pretty much the same language, and then the other one switches between two Indigenous languages quite regularly. So also wanted to just distinguish between types of multilingualism in terms of how we use the word multilingualism, which can be quite ambiguous. So people talk about individual multilingualism. So one person being multilingual means they speak more than one language. And in this case, we talk about linguistic repertoires, which is something I'm going to talk about in the next section, which is, the range of languages a person speaks. Then there's societal multilingualism. So we might say a community or a society or a region is multilingual. So there's people in that area who speak different languages, but they might not necessarily speak more than one. So in this case, we talk about language ecologies. How are different languages used in the one society? Are all people multilingual or just some? And are the people who are multilingual speak the same set of languages, like the same two languages, or do they all speak different range of languages? And just to make the point, around the world, most people, most societies are multilingual. So although having a special course on documenting multilingual contexts might make it sound like these are unusual contexts, in fact, these are the norm. I think people just sometimes when they're documenting one language have to ignore everything else that's going on. But when you're documenting multilingual contexts, you can embrace, I guess, everything that's going on in the community, more or less. So in terms of research on multilingualism, one of the most important approaches is Joshua Fishman's domain theory of multilingualism, in which he argued that if you have a society where multilingualism is stable, then the use of different codes or languages is separated according to domain. So people might use one language at home and one at work or something like that. Another theory is audience design, which suggests that one of the motivations between why people speak in different ways or use different languages is according to who's listening. So they're thinking about their audience and how to frame their language use. But neither of these ideas apply very well to small-scale multilingualism, which is the type of multilingualism we find in West Arnhem Land, that me and Jill are going to be talking about mainly today. So what you find that is you don't get polyglossia, so you don't get different languages with different status in society. So one is the language of school and one is a language of home or something like that. You also don't get lingua francas. So you don't get a common language which everyone uses to talk to one another, and then when they're at home, they speak their own language. So we can't fit local languages into specific domains of use or into some hierarchy of social status. People may use different languages with different people in pretty much the same context, basically. So there's quite a few assumptions about multilingualism in current research, which tends to focus on a migrant group, which is a minority within a country which has more of a monolingual identity. And so these assumptions often mean that each social group has its own language. So this idea of linguistic nationalism, that language defines a social group or an ethnic group. Or that languages are ranked in terms of status. And another very widespread idea is about linguistic accommodation. So one of the main things that motivate what language people choose to use in any situation is linguistic accommodation. So trying to fit with the other person they're talking to, trying to match the language that they're using. So in looking at small-scale multilingual contexts, we need to resist these assumptions because they don't really apply or explain how people use language or how people think about language. So ways of resisting these assumptions are a stronger foundation in ethnography. So spending more time talking to people about their perspectives on language and looking at how people use language, and taking existing ideas from research on multilingualism, examining them critically in the light of what you find. Also, we need people doing research in a wider range of settings to try and show that there's lots of different ways of doing multilingualism. And also centre the voices of language speakers who are currently peripheral to debates, so that, you know, we can get their view on why multilingualism occurs, I guess, in their communities and what's driving it. So the second topic that I'm going to talk about today is repertoires and ecologies. So linguistic repertoires are a great place to start when you're looking at multilingualism, especially in communities where you have a lot of diversity in terms of people's language identities and what set of languages they speak. And this is true for a lot of multilingual communities once you start looking at individual people and their languages. So the linguistic repertoire is a way of exploring individual multilingualism. But through looking at individuals, we can also get an idea of the broader society, particularly if we're looking at pretty small communities like me and Jill. So it's based on the idea of a musician's repertoire. Each musician has a different range of songs that they can play. In any multilingual society, each person has a linguistic repertoire that varies according to how well they speak or hear or understand each language, their relation to each language, so how they're connected to it or not, and how they feel about each language in the community, so language attitudes and that kind of thing. So to explore language repertoires, linguistic repertoires, we're going to do an activity which people often use in their research, and I've used at Warruwi, called the language portrait. And these are some examples I put up here for some research with users of sign language who came together for a workshop and talking about the different sign languages and written languages which they use. So the language portrait was popularized by Austrian linguist and sociologist Brigitte Busch, who used it as it had been used up to that point, mainly with school children, so looking at multilingual schools. And it's a great way for teachers to get a better understanding of the language backgrounds that their students bring with them, because teachers often don't have time to get to know them that well, and often assume that if people are, for example, from the same ethnic group, that their repertoire will be the same. So it's also been used with adults, and I have used it with adults and children. And it's great because it taps into a different mode of expression compared to talk. So if you're interviewing people, they're talking, and this is a way to reflect on language in another mode, which is visual and artistic. So what I'm going to do is send around an outline. I'll just show it to you actually. Let me just get it up. Yeah, so I'll give you an outline like this, and then we'll put you into breakout rooms in pairs, and so you can each colour in one using the annotation tool. So just a tip, I'll send it around in the chat, but if you open it up, go into full screen mode, then share one copy with each other. And then if you haven't used it before, there's a little pencil in your toolbar, in your Zoom toolbar that says annotate. And then you should be able to choose the thickish wiggly line that says draw and sort of colour it in. And then you could also use text and put, you know, your languages, that kind of thing. Any other tips? Yeah, so you also want to remember to save it. There's a special toolbar that comes up once you click annotate, and then you'll be able to save it, because once you stop sharing, it just disappears, all the drawing and stuff. So if you could save it, we might have time, I think, to, when we come back in a larger group, to sort of chat about our language portrait. So if you save it, then you could share it and we could chat about it. Welcome back, everybody. I just want to respond to a question from Hao Yi about how to get a copy of the slides. I think we'll put the slides in the video, and we'll send a link around to everyone who's registered. So if we need to edit it at all, we'll do that first. So it might not be straight away. I thought I'd just show you a language portrait that I did quite a while ago when I started doing it with people. I think I thought it'd be interesting to do it with people in the field while they were doing it. So yeah, I think I had to draw my own outline because I hadn't prepared any at that point. But I've put in the middle here purple for English. And I think that's something they find across the board, that generally people put languages which are most important to them around the head and the chest. Then languages which are less important or which they're less confident in on the hands and feet. So I put Polish, a little bit of foot there in pink, because it sounds familiar, but I don't really speak it. But it doesn't freak me out, I realized, because I went to a conference in Poland with an American woman and she was a bit freaked out. What are we going to do? Because it was just in a small town. How will we speak to people? And I was like, I don't know, but it's going to sound familiar, so I won't feel so freaked. Actually, quite a few people spoke English whenever we got into strife. So, so would anyone else like to share their language portrait and have a chat about it?
You want to do ours, Nick?
Yeah, sure.
Mine's basically not a multilingual language portrait, more of a bilingual language portrait, with English just in this cloud kind of following me and encompassing me. Sometimes I even feel that, of just like, sometimes I say things in English and I'm like, man, I just use English all the time. That's crazy. And I can't say things any other way. But I do have some, you know, other random Romance languages and stuff in the back of my head up there from school. and then languages of the lands that I've kind of grown up with, but, you know, haven't made it into me.
Yeah, and then mine is kind of similar, mostly English, a little bit of Auslan because I did like a little intensive last winter. Italian from uni, a couple classes. French, kind of similar, did that in uni as well. But then Greek is in my heart as a kind of heritage language. So yeah.
Thanks, guys. Would anyone else like to talk about their language portrait?
We can have a go, Annie, if you're okay with that, because you had a bunch of stuff on yours. I think it'd be interesting to show. Yeah, I could share that. So you can just ignore us in the corner there and focus on the portraits. I can start with mine. So mine's on the left, and I realize I should have maybe put labels, but I can talk about it. So the two main ones for me, the green is English and the orange is Hindi, because I grew up speaking both of them, and I mix them a lot as well. So you can see that the colors are kind of in the middle, they're really mixed, because for me, they're kind of, I think they come maybe from the same part in my brain. But then I also have this kind of like darker green a little bit, which to me is, I guess, a more Australian style English. So it's not really a new language, but it's a different way of speaking a language I already knew that I've kind of adapted in the last few years that I've moved here. And then I have red, which is French, and blue, which is Korean, which are languages that I've kind of learned extensively and that I actually also teach now. And then the yellow at the bottom is Marathi, which is a language that is the language of the region that I grew up in. So I'm not very great at it, but I can definitely understand all of it pretty much. And I can also, I can make my way around. Yeah.
I started with, yeah, it was interesting, Ruth, to hear you say people put their early languages closer to the head and heart, because that's exactly what I did with English. Pichicha and Japanese were the three languages I was exposed to earliest. English is our family language. And then the rest is all of the bits of language I've picked up in the Pilbara. There's 31 languages up here, and people are really multilingual. And I haven't learned any single variety all the way through. But because we're on such a big dialect chain, it's all sort of connected, which I scribbled red all over the top. And there's a signed language, so I put on my hands that as well. And I feel like that understanding of multilingualism, where it's just little, you know, bits and pieces from a lot of different languages, works quite well up here. Maybe one day I'll learn one of the varieties in a bit more detail, but for now I can get by. So that's what I need to do.
Thanks, guys. That was really interesting. And they're very artistic, the designs that you came up with as well. I think we had another pair who were very keen to share, Manuel and Chloe. So maybe if you guys can talk about yours, and then I'll go back to talking and presenting a bit, and then maybe we can come back to them in the break if anyone wants to stick around.
Should I go first, or you want to go first, Chloe?
Go ahead, Manuel. I'll go after you.
So I put Spanish near my heart. That's my native language. Also at the center of my head, where my deepest thoughts reside, I guess. English is some sort of intellectual armor or shell, or some sort of self-presentational language, I guess. French and Catalan as my heritage languages, and then some other instrumental languages like Chinese or German. And also very close to my heart, but kind of messy, is Pola, which is my field language. very special to me, even though I'm not super fluent. That's it.
Ooh. So in my one, I've sort of just put my the different parts of my linguistic repertoire in different parts of my body as well. So I've put Irish, English, I guess one of my first languages / dialects, and I put in brackets hexagonal French, just because I started being specific about varieties. So they're green and blue, and they're kind of dotted around the different parts of my body, my brain. I put it in my ears and my mouth to indicate both reception and production, in my heart as well, and in my belly, because I think a lot of our experiences with food are related to language as well. And I put some in my feet for the ability to travel and go places with language. And I've also put in some other languages that I speak, so Irish and German, in different parts of the body as well. Not so much German in my belly, no. Less a fan of the food, Sasha. And I wanted to write in next to the white circle, that's the potential that my linguistic repertoire is not. I don't view it as full or complete, so it's the potential to learn more languages. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. That was really interesting too. So I'll just share my slides again. So this is actually these ones here that the sign language users did. That's the outline of the body that's used more commonly, but just through various accidents in the field, I ended up using a different outline, which is the one I gave you guys. Sorry, it's hopping around a little here. So we just thought we'd introduce you to Arnhem Land and the communities in which we work, and then have a look at some language portraits and language drawings that people we work with have done as well. So Arnhem Land is a remote, largely Aboriginal region. So there isn't many non-Indigenous people living there permanently. They're mostly just working various jobs and not always for that long. It's around 500 kilometres from Darwin and 97,000 square kilometres with around 20,000 inhabitants in quite a lot of different settlements and outstations. So it's a special Indigenous land, so you have to get a permit from the traditional owners if you're not Indigenous to enter. And it's very multilingual, so there's at least 20 different languages, and many of the traditional languages of the region continue to be learned by children, and Indigenous new languages such as Aboriginal English and Creole are generally not people's first languages, although people usually speak one of them. So here's a bit of a map just to give you some bearing. So here's Darwin, the regional capital. So to travel from Darwin to Warruwi is about an hour in a small plane, which travel a lot slower than a large one. And sometimes you can travel by land in the dry season as well, because there's a lot of flooding and rivers. It's only possible for some parts of the year, depending on how much rain has fallen. And Maningrida over here is a little bit to the east, and a bit further from Darwin as well. So this is a map of the whole of Arnhem Land, including East Arnhem Land, just giving you an idea of the main language families. So there's 4 main families in Arnhem Land. There's the Awajan language family here in blue, around the area where Warruwi is. Then where Maningrida is, you have 3 families coming pretty close together. So the Maningridan family is a small green circle, specifically around that area. Then you have the Gunwingun family in purple, which is mostly inland. Oops, sorry about that, apart from Gunbalang. Those languages are all inland. And then in East Arnhem, you have the Yolngu family, which is part of the, it's not really a family, the Yolngu group, which is part of the large Pama-Nyungan language family that covers most of Australia. But this patch is actually a little bit isolated from the rest of it. And then there's other languages that intervene before you get to the main blob of Pama-Nyungan. So one thing that's not on the map is sign language. So across this area, people speak alternate sign language, which is languages which are used alongside speech. So they're not specifically used by deaf people, although deaf people use them too. And so people will use them with or without speech. And they're relatively small compared to deaf sign languages. And across this area, not much work has been done on sign, but we know that there's similarities. So they're not restricted by the spoken language. So it's not the case that there's a Maung sign language, Gunbalang sign language, whatever. It's quite similar, but possibly there's distinctions between regions like East and Western Arnhem Land, and then more fine-grained differences as well, but not to the level of maybe that spoken languages are distinct. So anyway, to make a long story short, it seems like they support multilingual communication, because even if people do not have a spoken language in common, they probably have some signs in common. So it can support that communication. So I just thought as a little bit of an introduction to Warruwi community, as well as showing you these nice photos, most of which were not taken by me. I just play some short videos, which we made as part of an online language course in Maung that we're working on, where people just briefly introduce themselves. Sorry, I didn't do it the right way, so that little thing wouldn't cover up the subtitles. Start again.
And I'm like Nancy. Around Warruwi. Kani bamra ini. And I'm aral kang in Gamang. My name is Nancy. I was born and bred here at Warruwi. And the language that I have learned from my dad is Maung, that he taught me.
All right, and I've got one other one from Sandra. Sorry, is that thing, can you see that thing that's covering up the subtitles too?
It's fine, Ruth.
Is it? Okay, all right. Just covering them right up from my view. I'll just start again.
My name is Sandra and my skin name is Ngalngari. I'm from Warruwi and I was born here. And the language that I speak, Maung, that belongs to this place, Warruwi.
So I started doing language portraits with people at Warruwi a couple of years ago. And these are some examples. Nancy, who you heard from, her language portrait is down the bottom here on the left. So you can see she's very multilingual. And although she is very multilingual, she's not sort of unique in that way. So you can see Rosemary, whose portrait is above her, also has a lot of different languages. And in Nancy's case, she speaks most of these languages at least a bit, although the ones like Iwaja on the foot, perhaps she's doesn't get a chance to use much anymore. So maybe it's more receptive competence, ability to hear or understand that language. And you can see on the right, I've put two young people's language portraits, Tamia and Janet. So they speak a smaller range of languages. And people tend to learn languages as they grow up. So throughout their life. So they get, more multilingual as they get older. So I think it's time to hand over to Jill.
Great, I'll just share a parallel video from Maningrida. So this is a video that we made a few years back now with the Lura language and culture team at the Maningrida school, with some help from linguist Margaret Carew, who I don't think is here today, but she was going to be. So I'll just share that and let it speak for itself. Let's see. Give me 1 second.
My name is Cindy Jinmar Binyaya Mal Planjan, Arawa Jibena, Papur Mlarki. Maningrida community, NT, and we in RFC, we have 3,000 people with 30 outstation homelands area. The language in community, Maningrida community, Japana, Brada, Gunbalang, Nakara, Gurgoni, Guningur, Remberanga, Gune, Jenang, Wulaki, Ilngamata. The main language are Japana. The language we teach here is Brada, Japana, Gune, Jenang, and Ilngamata.
Yo, ngapa? Napalamiri nalangawala. Anyong nala. So ngapa? Amangani jeep school. Ngapa also dear wewa inyera dogorji clan group. Dogorji ngapa. And inyera chang kanya debiana. Diganya Jomi logo Lura representing Gonopai different mucha anawla mucha kami pin wala pa ni Lura yarnepo that's where gipo school anawla mucha kanepi wala pa Lura.
Hello, ngare yagre Stanley Jalara and ngare erwana jine school at Gralangole Jelanga Jira outstation Jamadi Yurungur Pamban airport Mall school Grale outstation Girungur Grale Baple Maningrida school. Okay, in Maningrida I am now usable chairperson and a language teacher. In our language activity we teach about bush medicine, we go out camping in Euro Point and Rocky Point, and we do this walkabout program with the kids, show them water holes, sacred water holes, bush tuckers, bush medicine, how to make spear, how to make boomerang, how to make clapstick, how to sing crockery, how to dance, how to collect clay for dancing, how to weave mat and make spear for dancing. That's it, I think.
Okay, Ruth, do you want to pop the slides back? So you heard 3 languages there. So Cindy initially was speaking in the Barada language, which is the largest speaker group in Maningrida, but it's not the language of the land where Maningrida is located. That language is in Jebana, which is spoken by the Gunabiji people, and it's the Dugariji clan group that owns Maningrida. And you heard from Joseph, who's a member of that clan, second. And then thirdly, we heard from Stanley, who was speaking Jinang and told us about his role at the school. And you can see some of the strategies to incorporate the local multilingual language ecology in naming practices in the school. So the council he was talking about is called the Yuya Bowl, group. So it's the word for fire, first in Njebana, the local language, and then in Barada, the biggest speaker group in the community. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into Maningrida and some of the local dynamics, and a small window into some of the local languages. Very multilingual place, depending on how you count it, up to 15 different languages spoken in a community of about 2,000 to 3,000 people. Do you want to head on to the next slide, Ruth? So one of the Lura language and culture team members, a Barada woman, Laurie Grelela, she had actually seen a video of Ruth doing the language portrait task with some folks over at Warruwi, using the language portrait outlines. Ruth made a film with Bob Holman back in maybe 2015, was it, Ruth? Something like that. And Laurie thought these were great and suggested that the team at the school also do language portraits. And so they all sat down to do it and had a conversation about how best to do it. And quite quickly threw out the idea of using a bodily outline as the best way to present their language repertoires, the best sort of metaphor for talking about multilingual repertoires. Some people, as you'll see, did use the language outline, but it was very much a much more diverse group of portraits and drawings. So I'll talk you through some of what you're seeing here. So in the top left, we've got the two portraits from a young Barada woman, Abby Carter, who I've worked with quite a lot. And Abby chose the metaphor of a tree. I'm sorry that you can't quite see the annotations here, but I'll talk you through. So right down at the base of the tree, it's labelled with Barada, which is her patrilect, her father's language, her main language, the most important one for her. And then further up the tree, next along, she has Jinang, her mother's language, next in importance, according to local ideologies, as we'll see. Then Yolngu, and then Njebana, which is the language of the land that she lives on, and a language she hears and uses a little bit, but has less competence in. And then up in the branches, she's got Gune, which is a variety of Biningumwak, and also Guningu, another variety of Biningumwak, which she only has limited competence in, but which have a presence in the community. You'll note that two other languages that she has really good competence in, English and Creole, don't feature in her portrait at all, as they weren't seen to be important languages to her that were part of her linguistic identity. You'll also see a branch of eucalyptus flower. This is what are called martai flowers, which flower in the dry season. And the reason she chose this is because the dialect of Barada that Abby speaks is called the martai dialect. It's one of the easternmost dialects of Barada. And the emblem of the clan groups associated with this dialect is the martai flower, and it's also what the dialect's named for. So that was an emblem for her of her dialect identity within Barada. The very sort of dark illustration here is Stanley's language drawing. Can't really tell, but what's going on here is that there are three ancestral beings traveling through the landscape, and each of them is speaking a different language. So what Stanley's referencing here is the connection between language and land that goes back to the sort of origin stories common across Indigenous Australia about where languages come from and their connection to land. And so he's illustrated Barada and Jinang and some other languages and their origins. In the top right, very small writing again, I apologize. This is Alistair's portrait. So Alistair's got lots and lots of different labels on here, and what he's labeled is both languages but also kin. So he's got different kin categories labeled on there. This tells us which languages he speaks and which kin he has connected to those languages through. And another layer that might be of interest to some of you is that in the local alternate sign language, different body parts refer to different kin categories. And for many of the languages that he's labelled on there, it aligns with the particular place on the body where that kin is associated with, if that makes sense. So I think he's got his mother's mother on his forehead, her language there, his father on his shoulder, I believe. So that's an extra layer incorporating the sign language that's part of the local ecology. Laurie, down in the bottom left, has got a whole bunch of languages there, and she came up with her own system of distinguishing between the languages that she speaks. So in green, she's got the languages that she speaks fluently and connects to very strongly and uses on a more regular day-to-day basis. And then she's got different colours for other languages that she uses less frequently and that she can only hear. So that distinction between speaking a language versus just hearing it, so having receptive competence in the language. Rebecca had a similar idea, but instead of drawing a face, she drew a particularly locally salient yam that connected to all those languages. And then finally, Karen on the right has labelled a series of interconnected circles with kin and languages again, so different people in her family who she connects those languages to. So lots of really interesting ways to conceptualize language, lots of language ideologies implicit in these metaphors. And yeah, really interesting stuff from an activity that we thought was just going to be something quite quick that would just represent languages in a sort of static way. It was really dynamic. I think back to you, Ruth.
I think you were going to talk about the next.
Oh yeah, sorry. Well, I don't want to
slide,
so yeah, just quickly, a little bit more detail about one of the language repertoires of Abby in the top left. So this is Abby, and these are the languages that she had annotated on the tree. So you can go on to the next slide, and we can just see a little bit more detail about how these languages exist in her life. So Barada, the Martai dialect, is her main language, as I mentioned. Jinang is her mother's father's language, and that's someone she grew up with, so that's a really important language for her as well. Yongumata, she's connected to families further east in Arnhem Land, and she uses that language when she's with them over east. In Jebana, being the language of Maningrida itself, she has some limited competence in, and when she's staying down at her place in what's called Bottom Camp, she uses it a lot with a lot of the Njebana neighbours down there. Similarly with Guningu, using that around town with the large number of people who speak Guningu as a first and second language. And then English, of course, she uses with Balanda, that's the local term for white people, and in particular public context with other Indigenous people. But generally speaking, English is a secondary preference for communication between local folks. Yeah, all right, thanks, Ruth.
Thanks, Jill. And yeah, that thing about people not putting English on their language portraits was something I found at Warruwi too. Generally people didn't, and I guess I was wondering there if it was to do with the body and, you know, representing themselves and not seeing English as necessarily a part of themselves, but something associated with other people that they use with other people. But it's interesting that those other drawings weren't of the body, but still people generally didn't put English in because it was still about themselves, I guess, and their identity, which isn't very tied up with English generally. All right, so I'm just going to talk a little bit more about language ecologies and small-scale multilingualism. What is language ecology, first of all? So when we research multilingualism, we want to understand how it is that languages coexist with each other. So how they keep how that sort of system of multilingualism is reproduced over the generations, rather than, for example, shift to a single language occurring. So we need to look at the whole picture, not just languages, but the broader society, the culture, and the environment that the languages exist within, to see what supports them and what motivates continued use of all these different languages. So when we're documenting multilingual contexts, we really want to look at that broader language ecology to understand how all the different languages and different social groups and the place all interact. So when we're doing a research project, we might have a specific focus. Like, for example, at Warruwi, I work particularly with that community, and also even more specifically with people known as Walaya, the Cliff Camp group, which is just the people who I happen to end up working more closely with, people who identify with Maung a lot. And so that's sort of, I'm looking at the language ecology from that perspective. But people such as Paddy Epps have also talked about small-scale multilingualism as requiring a complex regional system. So, for example, we might look at a larger area like the whole of Western Arnhem Land as a sort of complex regional system where there's all different social groups, all different languages, and they all interact and sort of mutually support one another in various ways. So that's an even more large-scale way of looking at it than language ecology. In terms of the Western Arnhem Land language ecology, if we wanted to sort of generalize across Western Arnhem Land, we'd say multilingualism is the norm, but speakers of larger varieties such as Biningunwok, which have 1,000 or 2,000 speakers, tend to be less multilingual than people who identify mainly with a small language like Maung, which only has a few hundred speakers. So people who speak Ngunnawal, for example, are more likely to understand other languages but not speak them, because they might assume that a lot of people understand their language because it's more widely spoken. So as we talked about before, languages like Lan are owned by the patrilineal clan. So the clan membership is passed on through the father's line. So like Jill was saying, the father's language is seen as the main language of identity. Even if somebody doesn't speak that language, for whatever reason, if they grew up with other family, not their father's family, that'll still be an important language to them, even if they don't speak it. Another thing which is seen as characteristic of this area and small-scale multilingualism more generally is an egalitarian attitude to languages. So it's not the case that one language is seen as better and sort of inherently better and sort of, you know, more at a higher cultural status than other languages. Each language has its area of land and therefore has its sort of value that way. Just a second. Sorry, just a little visitor. So I think I haven't quite finished the previous slide. I can get back there. Language naming, something Jill and I have worked on. Some languages, like Ngunnawal languages, you can actually name them down to the clan level. So each clan is seen to have its own language, which might be characterized as just a few lexical items that are particularly salient. In the Wajan language family, languages like Maung, that doesn't seem to be the case. People don't see each clan as having necessarily its own language, but maybe at the level of clan aggregate, which is like a larger group, they might say, oh, they sort of use these words. Linguistic exogamy, which is marrying someone who has a different language identity to you, is fairly ordinary in this area. It's not obligatory, like in some places. You don't have to marry someone with a different language, but because you marry someone of a different clan, often you do marry someone of a different language. Traditionally, women, their first marriage was when they're relatively young and they're expected to learn to speak their husband's language. How much this carried on to future marriages is not clear, but that's a traditional view, that they should learn to speak their husband's language so they can speak it to the children for whom their father's language will be their main language. Receptive multilingualism is common, particularly at Warruwi. It seems to be very common practice for people who either know each other well or spend a lot of time together to still use a different language than the other one when they're speaking together. Code switching between two Indigenous languages is not unknown, but I find when I'm recording people, generally they tend not to switch between Indigenous languages because I think it's not seen as perhaps for a more formal kind of language, or where other people are going to be listening to you, or you're sort of representing yourself by being recorded as a member of your group. Switching between Indigenous languages among adults is probably dispreferred. And even between English and Indigenous language when making recordings, but it's more widely heard apart from that. So I just thought I'd compare Western Arnhem Land with some other sites of small-scale multilingualism. So what we find in these areas is very high linguistic diversity. So you get a lot of different languages, and these languages are often from different families. But across these different places around the world, people have different repertoires and there's different language ecologies. So at the opposite extreme is the Dagestan region of the former Soviet Union in Caucasus. So what you find here is often monolingual villages. So each village, most people in the village will be monolingual, and people tend to marry within the village, and they only learn the language of other villages if they have to. So if they have to work there, or if they are somebody who travels around selling crafts around the region. So that's very different to Warruwi, where most people are multilingual and marry and grow up with people from different language backgrounds. In the Valpes, which is probably the most well-studied example, there's linguistic exogamy, which means you have to marry someone of different language to you. which is because a language forms the boundary of an ethno-linguistic group. So language defines your social group as the most important social group, compared to Western Arnhem Land, where your clan is the most important group, which is not bounded by language because you share your language with other clans. Also, there's fairly strict avoidance of code switching, and also power imbalances between river people and others. So it's a bit of a different social context. Southern Papua New Guinea is a very multilingual area, but the extent of multilingualism depends on how close a village is to the edge of a language area. So you might have a certain area where a language is associated with. If you're in the middle of it, you might be less multilingual because you interact with villages around you who also have the same language. If you're on the edge and the borders between language areas, you might be quite multilingual because the villages around you are speaking different languages. Another well-documented case is the Lower Fulham in Cameroon, which is where there's been research over the last few decades. People, each village is associated with a language, but people want to learn the languages of other villages to build their social networks and connect with sources of spiritual power. So each village has its own religious cult. And in order to connect with that, you need to speak the language of the village. So that's another motivation. And also the Casamance region of Senegal, which is a very multilingual region. So all different practices support multilingualism there, including informal fostering, which also happens a lot in Western Arnhem Land, which is where children stay with different families as they're growing up. So they'll move between families, not just because there's no one to care for them in their family, but also as a way to build connections with different families and that kind of thing, and to help care for other family. So Jill has made a really great map where you can see these sites I mentioned. So there's the Valpes in the Amazon region of South America, Casamance in Senegal, and just north of that is the Lower Fulham area. Oh, sorry, just south of that, Lower Fulham area in Cameroon. And you'd think I know Zoom by now, but Dagestan over here, and then Southern New Guinea. So we've still got about 10 minutes before the break, and I think we were talking about having a bit of a chat, maybe showing more.
You muted yourself.
No, I was waiting for you to talk, but I think I remember now what we were talking about. The plan was, it seems like when everyone introduced themselves in the chat, people work in a lot of interesting different contexts. So we're just wondering if anyone wanted to pipe up and talk about the context where they're working and what it's like.
Manuel, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the Vola setting that you mentioned. You said there were 6 varieties, is that right? Is he here? Maybe not.
Sorry, I'm on mute.
Ah, there you are.
Yeah, it varies a lot from individual to individual, but because these are all very small villages, some of them are only 60, 70 people. The village I work, it's about 400 people. So very closely related varieties, but different enough to qualify as separate languages are Pola, Pala, Pula, those are 3. And then the larger scale minority community, the Nisus, the people who get like primary education have to go to school in that other village, so they learn that language as children. And then the shamans, who hold like a very prominent place as wise elders in the village, have to learn how to sing and do rituals to send the deceased into the netherworlds and whatnot in medieval Nisu, so that's another variety. And then intermarriage with a rather distant village called the Alo also brings in some people who speak some other languages. And then there's, of course, 2 varieties of Chinese, the local partly creolized variety, and then some of them can speak standard Chinese, which is what they did with me at the beginning, before I switched to speaking mainly only Pola. So those are the varieties, but it's very variable. Women tend to speak fewer varieties, and more specifically, they tend to speak zero or very little Chinese.
And how does it work with, so you talk about marriage between distant villages. Is the expectation that people marrying into a village will adopt the language of the village they're in, or the languages of the village they're in, or do they bring their own language and continue to use it?
Yeah, people who have married into my specific village can all speak Pola. They have all learned to speak Pola, even when they come from majority languages. Like, for example, the Nisu, which Polas otherwise have to learn when they go to primary school. If a Nisu person marries into Luodi village where I work, they will learn how to speak Pola generally. I just remember there's also some a few Hani women from yet another ethnic group, and reportedly it took them about 3 years to learn to speak the language. So it's quite different. But then you can also hear in the village itself, you can hear them speaking when they do cluster together. And a lot of families are mixed backgrounds. They might be mixed Pola, Nisu, or whatever. And so sometimes when the repertoire of people that are gathered matches, you might hear 2 or 3 separate languages. But obviously the dominant language in the village is still Pola. Even the village council government people, when you walk into the office, most of the time they speak in Pola rather than Chinese, unless they have like people from provincial government visiting the village and whatnot.
Thanks, so interesting. Does anybody else have a setting they'd like to tell us a little bit more about, or equally a background they'd like to tell us a little bit about? There were a few people in the chat who mentioned heritage language contexts, where some of these practices that we're describing as characteristic of stable multilingualism across many generations, we also see in sort of migrant contexts or language shift contexts. Does anyone have anything to say about those sorts of contexts?
I guess I can talk a little bit about my migrant context. So I don't speak, so I'm Greek background, but I don't, and all my grandparents came from Greece and they all speak Greek and English. And my mum can speak fluent Greek. My dad, bit like me, I can't speak fluent too much. But when I'm speaking to my grandparents, they mostly speak like Greek and then like a bit of mixed English as well. And I understand all of it. So it's receptive, but then I usually respond back in English, maybe with a few Greek words, but mostly like, you know, very common things like yaya papu, which is like grandma, grandmother. So yeah, that's mostly the situation. And then, yeah, I guess it's a bit of accommodation as well, to make me understand, like them using a bit of English as well. Yeah, so a bit of the things that we've been talking about.
Thanks, Nicholas.
If I may just, because you're talking about ideologies, the Polas have this playful approach to language where they're always trying to learn your language. They're always asking me to teach them Spanish, for example. And one of my aunties, she kind of like already knows a few sentences. So it's this very beautiful scenario where we speak in Spanish in the middle of a rural village in China.
I was sort of interested to hear from Felicia about her research too. I don't know if she's...
Yep, I'm here. Okay, so just a little bit of background. I think is considerably a multilingual society. So even for myself, I think the main languages that I speak would be English and Mandarin, which are driven by language policies, because Singaporeans are kind of known to be pragmatic. So any language that they use have to have some kind of linguistic capital in that sense, I guess. So some other languages that I can actually speak, and I mean, in terms of the language context, I think there would be Chinese dialects, like Cantonese, Hokkien. And so I guess, I don't know whether Singlish is considered a language, but that is something that is very close to everybody's heart in that sense, because it kind of, it used to have this very negative connotation, like, oh, it's non-standard English, so people shouldn't be speaking Singlish, which is like the more informal, casual, non-standard variety of English. But now I guess with the younger people, it has kind of evolved into something that it represents national identity in that sense. So in my research, I'm making language use among adolescents. So that might come into play, because I think, I mean, not just Singlish per se, but many of the other languages that people might come into contact with, like what I have mentioned. Yeah, so that's that.
Thanks, Felicia. So we should probably officially start the break now. So yeah, you're welcome to go away and come back at 3:30. But if you want to stick around and chat, you're very welcome to. And I don't know if there's other people who would like to present their language portraits. I'm sure people would be interested to hear about them.
Chloe, I wondered if Australian English was, you attempted to feature it at all in your language portrait, or whether it just feels like miles down the road.
Oh man, I think only on a lexical basis, but yeah, but yeah, receptively, sure.
Do you feel like a bidialectal English speaker, or do you feel quite monodialectal?
No, I think I feel pretty monodialectal. Like I feel like any sort of influence from other dialect is you know, unintentional and subconscious. Yeah. I wish that I was bidialectal, but
interesting.
Definitely not with Australian English. It's too hard. Too hard.
I wonder if it'd be an interesting thing to do with migrants acquiring or not acquiring Australian English, as to whether people see it as part of their core identity. Would they draw it on a language portrait or not? I wonder.
Yeah, I think because it's called a language portrait, I don't know how in tune people are with different varieties unless you kind of prime them somehow.
Yeah, for sure. I think for me it would be something that I would definitely put on a portrait, but I guess it's about how central it is to how you talk about your own language practices.
Yeah, like I've done language portraits with students before as well, and there is a tendency to kind of draw on just named, you know, languages, sort of monolithic. But if you can, it just depends how you introduce the exercise, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I started doing it at Warruwi, I was trying not to use the word language and stuff, trying to keep it open to, you know, different ways of talking and stuff like this, which is sort of how other people have done it. But I found, like, unless I was a bit more specific about the task, especially with kids, we'll get just a general colouring in that wasn't really connected to language at all. So I did end up having to sort of say language rather than more broadly, I guess, encourage people towards codes.
I think there's quite a lot of people here who work in Central Australia. I would be interested to hear if anyone has a sense of how people there might approach that task in terms of named varieties and closely related varieties and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I can try and speak to that a little bit, although it's not something that I really pay enough attention to. But so I work with Pitjantjatjara, but in that community, there's also a lot of people with Yankunytjatjara heritage. So they're really, really closely related varieties. But Yankunytjatjara's kind of been taken over. But there's a lot of people who would sort of say that they speak both. But I don't know, people, it's mostly lexical, like there's a few Yankunytjatjara words that people use. And then there's also like other individual people who speak other languages in the community, but it's not anything like in Arnhem Land. So there's, you know, a few people who married in who speak Warruwi or Pintupi or other Western Desert languages. But it's really, Pitjantjatjara is just the dominant language that everyone speaks all the time. And then English, obviously, in some settings. Yeah. I find the Western Desert dialect situation, I just still can't get my head around what it really means.
Yeah, you and me both.
Yeah. Especially when they're just so close. So you could have people speaking, like if the local variety of Pitjantjatjara uses some Yankunytjatjara words because it's on Yankunytjatjara land, but people say that they speak Pitjantjatjara but not yet. I don't know. It's really tricky.
Yeah. And I think Chloe's point about how you introduce something like a language portrait task is really relevant. I can certainly imagine like conversations I've had with people when we were doing the Barada dialect documentation stuff, the number of dialects that were kind of delineated in the moment would vary massively depending on what had been salient in the conversation. If we were talking about clan groups, you know, you might get 10 different Barada dialects reported at the level of, say, a clan, or you might get the sort of 3 big ones, which are more at the kind of clan aggregate level. And so that's something we'll come back to a bit later when we talk about language naming, but very commonly, particularly in cases of small scale multilingualism, grappling with at what level of granularity language names are applied, and sort of shifters between, you know, one term getting used differently by different subgroups and all that kind of stuff. It's a really difficult thing when you're tasked with putting it down on paper somehow and potentially misrepresenting everything. Felicia?
Yeah, I had a question about the language portraits that I think Ruth and you mentioned that you did it with the younger participants. Maybe could you share a little bit, because this is something that I would potentially be using for my fieldwork actually. So how difficult was it to elicit, you know, responses from especially the younger participants?
I'll let Ruth answer that because I haven't done so much with young people.
Well, it was harder with the primary school children who were probably aged like 7 to 10, but with high school aged young people, it was fine. Yeah. So how old are the people you're working with?
I'm looking at a range between 10 to 19. So I'm a little bit worried about the younger group actually, like how much of, you know, hand-holding do they need, and if I were too involved in it, would that skew certain, you know, like their responses and things like that?
Yeah, the way I did it with the primary school aged kids was to sit down with 2 or 3 around a table and record them while they did it and interview them while they did it, rather than with the adults. It was more do it first, then do interview, because with young kids, they need to have something to do, and just chatting is not as good. So it sort of works well like that. And as far as hand holding, I mean, it was fine. It's just, yeah, I didn't want to prompt people too much, I guess. And so some of them were just more, we're forgetting what the task was about, or not focused on the task and just enjoying colouring in, because teachers often give them something to colour in and some pencils. So they were just doing nice designs. So yeah, by the end, I started prompting them more and saying, oh, you know, which one is, you know, which colours representing which language and stuff like this. But there's quite a lot written about doing it with school students. And so I would look at those articles and people outline their methods, usually in a bit of detail, like exactly how they did it. Because a lot of those papers are in applied linguistics, where they have more the standard approach of writing an article. You have the methods section, the results section. So they'll actually be more specific about the methods. So you can see exactly what they did.
Thank you.
I can probably talk a bit about Central Australia because I live in Alice Springs and I work as an interpreter. And so I'm every week coming into contact with a lot of Aboriginal languages spoken here. And I think there's a lot of accommodation that happens. People really attempt to accommodate other speakers, and they'll speak as close as they can to their language.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because, yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff I've written about is about lack of accommodation where you might expect it. So it's interesting that people do that in Alice Springs.
Yeah, so I work as an interpreter in the Liaora language, and I find that a lot of people just sort of talk to me in as close as they can get. It might be Aranda or a language like that, and it's not really a Liaora, but it's they kind of accommodate as much as they can. And this sort of respect for people, that person speaks that language, let's change to their language or whatever we know of that, which might only be a few words.
Mm.
It's very much in contrast with sort of monolingualism, where there isn't that sort of recognition and understanding of people's languages and who speaks what. One of the things that I think people are very attuned to in Central Australia is knowing what language a person speaks. And even if I don't know that language, I'll use whatever words I know of it, because that will kind of make them feel good. Or I recognise and respect that person. And that's kind of it's a protocol.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one of the things people have written about before is, like, if you're on someone's land, it's good to try and speak a bit of their language, even if you only have a little bit.
It sounds like a similar situation to Njabina and Barara up in Maningrida, because similar situation here is you've got a community like Alikarung, which is dominantly Warlpiri speaking, but the actual traditional owners are Kadich, which is a tiny language with about 120 speakers. But there's a lot of deference paid to those traditional owners and to the language of that land. And so a language with a small number of speakers actually has quite a large kind of footprint in language ecology, it seems to me. I'm constantly being surprised at how many Kadich speakers there are around the place.
Mm.
Yeah, I really agree. And I think, and we'll touch a little bit on this a bit later, but I think that kind of ideology of the importance of the connection between language and land means that in particular communities, you've got that kind of intergenerational support for a language that perhaps might have been threatened in another setting if it didn't have that sort of localized prestige boost. Certainly in Maningrida, you, particularly in public settings, which are, very dynamic multilingual contexts, Barada typically will have a role very often mixed with English. You get that kind of Barada English very tight within the clause code mixing, but Njabina will also have at least equal, if not more, status, even though it's not a common L2 in the community. Many people don't understand it, but it's understood to be right and proper that it has that role there. And Guningu as well has a bit of a role because there's a lot of Guningu speakers. But yeah, it's always, Njabina always has that presence despite, fewer than 200 speakers, probably even less than that.
Jill, would you say that that's people, a lot of that is people for whom it's not a first language for either of them, talking in Debenham because it's right to do so, or?
I don't know that you would necessarily see that if, unless people had decent competence in it, you might see some kind of deference to particular lexemes. I've certainly seen that happen. So really like what Alex was just saying, where you're sort of a bit of a hat tip perhaps to the fact that it's the appropriate language. But no, it's not so much in kind of more, you know, informal dyads that you would see in Jebena coming out. That's more about the, I guess, the repertoires involved. It's very diverse strategies people come up with in the moment. For example, there's some like data from Vanessa Elwell's early work in Maningrida where she tracks Njebena multilingual, but in Njebena speaking shopkeeper across a lot of different dyads that he encounters across a few days, and different strategies basically every time, you know. And it's not that Njebena turns up more often than not because it's the language of the community, it's just that it's his language, and if other people speak that language too, that'll turn up. But I see it most in those kinds of public settings. So things like speeches at the school, at the church, and at the football. I've done a lot of recording and research at the football, where you've got, you know, very dynamic crowd setting, and then maybe 3 or 4 commentators up on the back of a flatbed truck talking to everybody, and Njebena is always in the mix there, partly because there are obviously Njebena speakers in the crowd, but also just it's unthinkable not to have Njebena as part of the mix. So particularly those public kind of broadcast settings, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask like public meetings, that type of thing. But then people would still be switching out when they sort of reach the limit of what they can talk about. Yeah,
that's right. And I think it's you see it particularly with Barada as a common L2, where people have some level of competence, but the, you know, Barada's really changed over the last sort of 40, 50 years as a common vehicle for incorporating English loans and loans from Creole. So I think Barada's really become there's no lingua franca really in Maningrida, but Barada English switching kind of serves a little bit like that in public settings, because people can get a grasp on it by incorporating more or less English as is needed. And you don't see that so much with Njebena. You don't see as much Njebena English switching, I think probably just because it's a less common L2. There's just not as much competence.
It's really interesting.
Guningu too gets switched. So we've talked about the Australian context a bit. We've talked about multilingualism and particular approaches to research in multilingualism, some key concepts in work that's been done, the idea of small scale multilingualism. Now we're going to step back a little bit to consider ways of thinking about language. So language ideologies, this came out a little bit in the language portrait task already, but we're going to just make sure that we're all on the same page about that and dig in a little bit deeper into the connections between language ideologies on the one hand, so what people say and think about language, and those sort of received ideas about language, but then language practices on the other hand. So it's not always a very clear relationship between the two. There's often some tension between language ideologies and observed practices. So what do we mean when we're talking about language ideologies? I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this, but let's just revisit just in case. So language ideologies have to do with what people believe and feel about language and languages that are in their social life. So they're sort of networks of beliefs, sets of beliefs that are in some way kind of self-evident. So they're not necessarily ideas that you would question or that you would be able to always determine the source of the idea. They're sort of self-evident or common sense ideas. And under the surface, they often hide the kinds of power structures that exist within a community or a society, and how languages get recruited into maintaining that power structure. So sets of beliefs that are held by a group about language, languages, language varieties, dialects, and so on, variation, and their role in social life. And so to quote the late, great Michael Silverstein, language ideologies are articulated by users as rationalizations or justifications of perceived language structure and use. Sorry, I never find my mouse in this view. Okay. And as I've said, they're often loaded with sort of the trappings of power structures and hierarchies and moral and political interests. We dig below the surface of language ideologies. That's often what we find. Lots of people have worked on language ideologies, some important names down the bottom. So let's have a look at some important ideologies that have come up from my research in Maningrida and also from Ruth's research in Warruwi. So some ideologies that are common around the Arnhem Land space when people are talking about language, often when people are critiquing what other people have said or doing a bit of gossip about what language a particular person's used or what they should have done, or when people are instructing children about the best way to speak and which languages to use. So very often language ideologies are part of early socialization routines that we engage with children, often loaded with language ideologies. So sort of training them to think the way that we do about language. So some that come up very often in the Arnhem Land context are that on the one hand, languages inherit to cultural identity. So we've heard some examples of this already from what Ruth said. So we can think about perhaps examples from Eastern Arnhem Land, where if you are a member of a particular clan, there's an ideology that that clan has its own distinct language, and that is the rightful language that you should be using, you should be learning as a child, and you should then use. And that's in lots of parts of Northern Australia is the patrolect, so the language that you inherit from your father's line, your father's father. And it may or may not be that this language that is understood to be a very distinct one as a level of the clan, it may or may not be very different from the language of the next clan along, but there's often an ideology that it is its own distinct language nonetheless, even though it perhaps might only be a small handful of shibboleth type terms, few lexemes of various kinds that actually distinguish your clan lect from the language, from the lect of the other clans in the region. So some other language ideologies that we've encountered already, this idea that you shouldn't mix languages. We'll come back to some of these in a moment and look at them in more detail. But this is something that you hear people say. To an extent, it maps onto practice, as we'll see, but it's a bit of a tense relationship between whether you should or shouldn't mix languages and what actually happens in practice. So related to the idea of the connection between language and land. So in the top right, which I can't actually see on my screen, let's move that. So the language belongs to this territory and this group of people. So, you know, lots of origin stories in the Australian context about the connection of language between language and land, as we saw in Stanley's language portrait. And also connected to that is the ideology you should be speaking your father's language. So kind of that connection between languages being implanted in particular tracts of land, you belong to a clan group by virtue of your sort of father's lineage, and then you inherit the language, you own that language by virtue of that connection. Going back to the language portraits of Laurie and Rebecca, they distinguished between languages that they could speak and languages that they could only hear. And partly that has to do with actual language practices, but partly it has to do with ideologies around languages that you own, that you are connected to through kin and through land. You are able to speak those properly. You have full access to them, but there are ideologies that state that if you don't connect to them through your kin and land connection, then you can't actually speak them properly. Whether or not you actually do have good competence in that language can be a different thing, but the ideology is there nevertheless. And then, as I mentioned, this ideology that this group speaks a different dialect to that group. Sometimes that's about actual linguistic differences, and sometimes it's just more about ideology, more about social or cultural differences to which language practices are recruited to shore up a divide that is perceived in the social space. And to quote Michael Silverstein again, so the ideological aspect of analysis is central and key to understanding how people experience the cultural continuities and interruptions in the particular case. So language ideology is really an important part of the picture when we're looking at multilingualism and multilingual practices. We want to understand how people are perceiving language, how they're thinking about how languages should be divided up and should be used. And it gives us an insight into sort of some of the drivers behind practices, but not necessarily what the practices are going to be. Okay. So let's have a look at some of these ideologies in turn. So first of all, the ideology that this language belongs to a particular territory, to a particular group of people. What I want to do now is have a look at some language practices and see whether they align neatly with this ideology or whether they differ somewhat from this ideology. And again, we're looking at the Arnhem Land space. So we've talked a bit about this with Alex's comments before and what I was saying about the role of Njebena in Maningrida. So because by virtue of the connection between Njebena language and the land of the Dugariji clan, where Maningrida sits, there are special rights that are conferred onto Njebena and onto the traditional owners of the land, and these rights equate to usage, essentially. So in particular settings, you see Njebena used very commonly. However, there are also practices that don't align very well with this ideology. And if we were just guided by the ideology and expected to see practices aligning with them, we would miss some things perhaps. So one key thing is that you might own a language by virtue of your clan and your father, but you might not in fact speak it. And vice versa, you might speak a language that you don't in fact own by virtue of that sort of ideologically prescribed connection. So very much can be tensions between the ideology and actually what happens in the, cut and thrust of day-to-day life, where you end up living, who you end up living with may not align neatly with this ideology. Also, the fact that speech communities, in inverted commas, we'll come back to that term, are often non-contiguous. They're not necessarily located right on the land where that language is understood to reside, perhaps due to the mobility of speakers or urbanisation or all sorts of different things. Okay. Did I want to say anything more about that? No. All right, now let's look at the ideology that you should mix languages. So this is something that I've written about a little bit in a recent paper. So people talk about mixing between traditional languages as being something that's kind of dispreferred. It's sort of seen as aberrant behaviour to an extent. It's not to say that it never happens, but it is the case that it is quite limited, at least in the Maningrida context. So I've looked across, a large multilingual corpus, looking at code mixing strategies right across that corpus. And most cases of code switching within the level of the clause, so you've got sort of two different kinds of code switching outside of the level of the clause, so intersentential code switching, and then code switching inside, where within a sentence or a clause, you've got material from different languages. And when you get that within the clause type mixing, it tends to be a traditional language and either English or Creole. So very rarely do you get mixing between two traditional languages in the Arnhem Land context, at least. Not to say it never happens, but it is much rarer. And there's certainly an argument to say that that is that ideology at work. Because if you look at the code switching literature, there's this idea that when you've got languages that have grammatical structures that are quite similar, that map onto each other, so say, for example, like Barada and Njebena, very similar structures, code switching should be easier in some way because you've got parallel structures. It's easier to switch from one to the other. However, a language like Barada versus English, very different structures. In some sense, it should be more difficult to switch from one to the other, and that's not what we find. And it's because there's social factors going on that block the mixing in one direction and allow it in another direction, having to do, I think, with what we were discussing in the chat before about perceptions of English's languagehood and Creole's languagehood. We see that play out in code switching as well. Chloe, let me see if I can get my chat back. For some reason I can't see the chat right now. There we go. Chloe, what did you want to say?
I just had a question about this lack of mixing, I guess. So, because I'm guessing that there seems to be a lot of knowledge about other languages. It's just people kind of keep them separate. They don't mix them.
Yeah.
But what about like a kind of classic case of mixing or code switching where, just like the right word doesn't come to you, or because of the domain or the topic or whatever, it just makes sense to use that other language. Do people do it then?
You get it occasionally, but my experience has been that there is usually some quite obvious social motivation for the switch, even that kind of insertional switching where you've got basically the matrix of one language and then just a noun dumped in from another language. So examples that I've got are someone speaking Barada, but then a Yolngu speaker's around and they want to talk about, you know, this person just brought that, and they'll, in deference to that person appearing on the scene, will put the noun in for that reason. So it's not super common, and when it does happen, it tends to be of that kind of insertional type where you've got one clear matrix and then a noun, typically a noun kind of popped in. What you don't see so much, except in quite specific contexts, is the kind of alternational code switching, where you've really got more of a kind of a mixed grammar, if you know what I mean, where it's not necessarily an identifiable matrix that other things are popped into. That's much less common. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, yep, sorry, go on.
Oh, just related to that then, just thinking about something like translanguaging, you've probably, I know you've, you know, spoken about this before and probably written about it as well, but how well does like translanguaging fit onto this then?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I would briefly, I think the translanguaging lens actually works very well for mixing between traditional languages and English or Creole. I think there's much less of a perception of a boundary there. I don't even think people would say that they were necessarily even mixing languages. It doesn't have that same kind of ideology. So going back to those kind of boundaries that are perceived between languages or not. Whereas, well, I'll show you the next slide. Whereas mixing between traditional languages, much more marked, I guess, is a way to phrase it. So there's a bilingual reader. This is in the school from 1981. It's in Njebena, and it's a last story about a drunk who gets up to some stuff, and the title of the book is A Drunk Got His Languages Mixed. And I think it's a particularly interesting one. Those of you who know anything about Njebena, there's non-standard spelling there, but I think it's an interesting one because it reveals a bit of that ideology of, you know, if you're mixing languages, you're not right. You've got something's gone wrong. You've lost control of your faculties, you know. So we saw Stanley drunk and he was speaking a mixture of two languages, Bunwingu and Njebena, which, you know, most people would have both of those in their repertoire. So, you know, it's not like it's a crazy thing to have that competence, but the mixing is seen to be something that's transgressive in some way. Yeah, great though, great question. Just to follow on from that, so we do see the ideology in some sense having some kind of power to limit, we sort of ban code switching in certain directions, but we see code switching all over the shop between traditional languages and colonial languages. And I do have some nice data of very kind of tightly woven code switching between Barada and Yanangu, which is a neighbor Yolngu language to Barada. And my theory on that, from having spoken to a few people, is that that's a kind of unique expression of a very specific multilingual identity. So the clan groups up in that corner of Barada territory are multilingual clans. They connect to both Barada and Yanangu. And so it's appropriate in that sense, perhaps, is my guess, to incorporate both in that kind of tightly knit code switching in a way that it isn't for other languages. But that's just a guess. I mean, we never really get to the bottom of motivations behind this stuff, but that seems to be something that's going on in any case. All right. So the third one I want to look at is this idea that you should speak your father's language. And I think this is actually a really powerful one in the Arnhem Land space, at least, and probably in other places. And I think it's a key one that's behind how some very small languages are actually maintained across generations. You know, so we've got languages in the Maningrida space, like, for example, Gurgoni, that has been maintained, you know, as long as we know, with, you know, maybe 100 speakers, not much more than that. And it's been sort of consistent around that size as long as we have records. And yet there are many other languages that have, you know, larger speaker bases in the Maningrida context. So how does that work? And I think a really interesting insight comes from Rebecca Green's work. She's a linguist, some of you might know. She's worked on collaborative work with Gurgoni documentation, and she talks about early socialization routines for young Gurgoni kids whose father is Gurgoni, but whose mothers are speakers of another language, a different language. It's not Gurgoni. So these kids are hearing their mother's language pretty much on the day-to-day basis as young children, not necessarily much of their father's language, depending on the situation. And she says that the very young babies of Gurgoni fathers they're being held and they're told, excuse my pronunciation, Ngarpu Gurgoni Ngiweki ya. You speak Gurgoni, don't you? So even though their mums are speaking different languages, they're constantly being told, you speak Gurgoni, you speak Gurgoni, this kind of ideology being socialized very strongly. And when the kids are old enough to respond, they're then prompted with Yitangao, which is say yes, you got to say yes, that Gurgoni is your language. So we see those socialization routines kind of influencing practice in some way, not necessarily in a straightforward way, but in some way. However, we also see plenty of examples of either late or in fact non-acquisition of the father's language. So it's not a fail-proof method. So I've heard a little bit about sort of in Eastern Arnhem Land, people worried that young kids are not learning their appropriate clanlect until they're teenagers or adults. They're not kind of getting that competence early on. So ideology only takes you so far, but I think it is a powerful one in understanding how these small speaker bases have been maintained long-term. I think it's pretty important. Yeah, Chloe.
Sorry for the constant questions. No, this is interesting. I'm just, because, okay, so some people are not learning their father's language. So I'm wondering why. And then how involved are the mothers in encouraging their children to speak their father's language? Do they play a role in that, or are they only concerned with passing on their own language?
I mean, I think the answer is that it varies massively. I think in terms of why they're not learning their father's language, there's a whole host of reasons. Some people's dads just aren't around, all the kind of usual reasons. No, there's no kind of cultural reason why they don't have access to their father's language, just, you know, accidents of life developments, you know, that kind of stuff. Very common that people might be raised by, you know, perhaps grandparents or something like that in a place where they're, you know, all sorts of reasons. And look, I mean, in practice, I don't know. There's certainly plenty of reports, and I've seen examples of mothers explicitly socializing their children into their father's language, whether or not they have the competence. So in the same way that Rebecca Green's talking about with Gurgoni. I don't know whether, you know, there's also a bit of, yeah, but also speak my language as well. I'm not sure. You know, we've got some practices that we've observed that tell us that ideology is very much in force, but I'm sure there's lots of other things going on. Must be working to an extent though, because, you know, most of the languages that were originally in the Maningrida region are still there, you know, and that sort of seems to be the mechanism through which intergenerational transfer is happening. Okay. So that's language ideologies and language practices. Very much on a related note, we now want to talk a little bit about ethnography and the idea of social categories and locally salient social categories. So borrowing a little bit from variationist sociolinguistics here and sort of slooping it into multilingualism studies, because I think there's a lot to be learned from those approaches in terms of how we figure out what are important categories in the local space. So ethnography, look, most people are going to know what this means, but let's have a look at a definition just to make sure. So a quote from Penny Eckert here. So ethnographic studies focus on, sorry, I've covered up my own quote, smaller communities for relatively long periods of time. So, I mean, ideally with ethnography, you've sort of narrowed the scope to an extent of what you're looking at. So you're not looking at a huge community the size of Melbourne. You might not even a community the size of Brunswick. So to really get to grips with what are the locally salient semiotics, I guess, you might be looking at a particular subculture, perhaps a small community, something that you can kind of get to grips with. And ideally you want to be able to invest some time in doing this. It's arguable whether you can succeed at all as an outsider. So very important then that you have collaboration, support from within the community. And so you're aiming to discover rather than to assume what locally salient social categories exist. And these categories are discovered in virtue of their place in local social practice. So ethnography is very much of a place. It's something that's conducted on site in collaboration with members of the community, or indeed by members of the community who understand and have been socialized into the norms and the semiotics of that community. So in terms of multilingualism research, this is hugely valuable. I would say an essential foundation for work. So, I mean, I think this is probably why if we look across sort of the recent resurgence in multilingual studies, it's often come from people who've worked in the community for, you know, many years, and then have perhaps done language documentation, done a lot of that ethnography over time, and then have switched to multilingualism studies at that point, once they understand a little bit of what's sort of at stake locally. Sorry, I can see, whoops, that there's some questions, so just going to have a quick look. 1 second, sorry, the questions don't pop up very obviously. Thank you. Yolngu people tend to have special relationship over their maternal grandmother's language. Yeah, absolutely. So that's right. I mean, you know, these ideologies can recruit all sorts of different connections to kin. That's right. Okay. All right. So it takes time. It's really hard work. It's, you know, it can be quite impossible in some settings, but the key really is the value of community members as collaborators. And it's also really valuable if you can manage to be working within some kind of team-based approach. So you might have, Ruth has some nice examples of how this can work. So she's worked with musicologists, for example. So teams that involve approaching cultural practice from different angles, and then triangulating findings can be a really rich way to sort of do ethnography together in collaboration with the community. Lots of ways that you can involve community members as collaborators. This is not an exhaustive list, just some stuff that that we have been doing. So research design from the very beginning can be collaborative and you know, and should be really. It might be useful to locate some kind of local elected or understood to be able to speak on behalf of the community, a group like that. So in Maningrida, there are a few places. There's the Lura Language and Culture group at the school who have been incredible in fostering language research in the community, but there's also the Cultural Research Office at the Arts Centre. So every community is going to be a little bit different with regard to who the right people are, who has the authority to say, yeah, this is a good thing to do and let's talk about it. In Warruwi, there's a language centre of sorts that sort of has the authority to do that kind of thing. Data collection in a team can be really wonderful, really useful. So you can see here in the top right, Cindy conducting an interview that I would never in a million years have been able to do because my Barada isn't good enough, but wouldn't even have known the questions to ask that Cindy was able to ask about the particular stories that go behind the dialect divisions in Baradas. This is her mother, Mary Judd Balak. So that brought an incredible richness to the data collection to have local folks conducting the interviews where possible. Also training and language work has been a big part of, I know, Ruth's work, and I'm trying to do that as well. So in the bottom left here, I'm working with Marlene Kernan, a young Guningu woman, on transcription, and Ruth here, I think, is that Janet Mardbender she's working with perhaps, and they have a long-term collaboration. Transcription and translation, very important to have local help with that. If you can, co-authorship, presenting at conferences can be a really nice thing to do as well, if that's something people are wanting to be involved in. And something we've done in Maningrida is also setting up a local archive that has local custodianship and is a useful, hopefully, way to leave language recordings locally in a way that can be accessed by local folks, rather than sticking it in an archive that no one is ever going to look at again. If you can have something local, that can be a really nice thing to do. And also it can be something that people can get involved in finding legacy materials at, you know, say IATSIS or whatever, and bringing those back to the community. That's something we've done a little bit. Okay. So now, related to this idea of ethnography, I want to talk a bit about some of the social categories from traditional approaches within variationist sociolinguistics. And the reason is that these work in variationist sociolinguistics has already tapped into some of the shared salient social categories across different communities, and has already done some of the work for us in figuring out how to make those locally salient, what works, what doesn't work. So here are the sort of the traditional primary macro-sociological categories. And, you know, I want you to imagine if you were armed with some of the original, you know, literature in variationist sociolinguistics and thought, these must be the important categories I'm looking for, and ended up in a remote Indigenous community and tried to operationalize some of these ideas, you would have trouble. Okay, so the idea being that these work for some of those, I guess the weird contexts, the Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic contexts. But even then, we've moved quite a way beyond these categories now. So you want to be careful with what you're armed with when you rock up in a community intending to do some ethnography. All right. Just having a look at the chat, sorry. Ruth, you're back now, so maybe you can just yell at me if I need to attend to the chat. Is that all right?
It seems pretty good. I just answered one.
All right, great. It's not popping up obviously for me, so I'm just going to ignore it unless someone tells me to look at it, if that's all right. Great. Okay, so these factors kind of emerged from sort of, I guess, what has been termed the first wave of variationist sociolinguistics. And then we can look at, you know, what have been termed the second and third waves, which are more of an ethnographic turn within sociolinguistics, and which look at what are actually salient in the local context. The second wave very much ethnographically driven, and the third wave kind of looking at how we manipulate language practices for stylistic reasons, I guess, could be one way to sum it up. So things like gender and sexuality coming more to the fore, and also more sort of de-essentialized versions of those earlier categories become important. So yes, ethnicity is important, but it's not necessarily an immutable thing that lines up very neatly with one variant or one language or whatever it is. There tends to be some flexibility. Individuals do different things across different contexts and so on. Also the importance of the community of practice model. So understanding that communities that are defined by shared engagement in some activity or, you know, attending a school or something like that, that's a really important level at which norms, language practices kind of emerge. Acknowledgement of mobility and just acknowledgement of how these things are quite complex and shifting and not just sort of a simple one-to-one correspondence between practices and these macro categories. So lots of interesting stuff to look at across these evolutions in variationist sociolinguistics that I think are really useful for multilingualism studies. Because you sort of think about it, particularly in a small scale multilingual context, the multilingual repertoire isn't actually so different from a monolingual repertoire where you've got lots of access to different variants, different dialects, different sociolects, whatever it might be that makes up your repertoire. It's not necessarily the case that we should be treating a multilingual repertoire as very different to how we treat a monolingual repertoire in terms of analysing variation and things like that. Okay. So some social categories, again, not an exhaustive list that's come out of work in Northern Australia. The clan tends to be pretty central in terms of where people are hanging their affiliations and their language practices and how they're justifying them in terms of ideologies. Region is a factor, but in a different way to, you know, what we might have seen in, say, Trudgill's work in Norwich or something like that. Region here connects to that idea of, you know, connecting language to land, territorial affiliation, but also increasingly in recent times, we see the role of more urban communities as categories to affiliate with or not. So to take the example of Barada, pre-colonially, various regional differences right across Barada territory, but nowadays we might talk about Maningrida Barada as being its own variety that has been developed through, I guess, the use of Barada as an L2 in that community. So that's changed the grammar, it's changed sort of some of the lexemes and much more English incorporated in that variety, for example. So we see the role of urban communities much more than we used to. Moiety in eastern Arnhem Land, for example, is an important sociolect, I guess. Age is something that I don't know whether we'd say that pre-colonially age was a big factor in differences in language practice. That's arguable, I guess, but certainly more recently, we're seeing the emergence of youth subcultures. So for example, in John Mansfield's work on gangs in Wadia, that's something that's very salient in that local context. Sex and gender. I mean, there's some research on, is it Yanyuwa John Bradley's work on Nyanyua, men's dialect versus a women's dialect. So there were some differences. Thanks, Ruth, to remember that on the spot. Presumably gender comes into it, but we just know nothing about that really. It's pretty under-researched in the Northern Australian context. Prestige is an interesting one. So prestige has a big role in, traditional sociolinguistic description. We could say that prestige has no role in Indigenous Australia if we're kind of thinking of like egalitarian multilingualism as not really having prestige in the same way. But as we've heard, there are senses in which there's a sense in which you get localized prestige, that a particular language in a particular context has its own kind of prestige, but it's not inherent to that variety in a way that it is in a diglossic multilingual context where the high language is the prestigious one, for example. Yes, communities of practice, but also from Jim Stanford's work, the idea of communities of descent is an interesting one. So affiliation to a patrilect or a matrilect or what have you, that can be a really fruitful way of approaching those. And so what does this actually mean for us then for researching multilingual practice? Well, basically language choices at any level, be that a sort of variation or code choice or whatever, are going to hinge on those locally salient social categories. So they're always going to be important for choices that are made in language practice. Okay. So I'm going to move on now to something that's a related topic really, related to ethnography and those social categories, but it's looking at the way that language varieties are named. And these are decisions about language naming and how you define, say, the speech community that or communities that you're encountering are decisions that you have to make sort of quite early on in your research journey. They're often decisions that people do make initially based off of a few conversations with speakers, and then that's established for the whole rest of whatever the research journey is, for better or worse. And so it's worth, I think, pausing at that moment to consider what it is you're actually kind of setting in stone in some way, about how you're drawing boundaries between languages and how you're naming them. So a key issue here is what the speech community actually is. So a few different definitions are out there. So we could think of the speech community as a group of people who share a common grammar. That's sort of a pretty common definition. Everyone who, let's see, speaks Australian English, we've got a common grammar, common lexicon, and so on. So that seems valid, but do we also want to think of it as a group of people who interact using speech, say on a day-to-day basis? That also seems like a really, legitimate way to approach what a speech community is. The problem is when you look at a really multilingual community like Warruwi or Maningrida, those things don't actually line up. So are we considering the speech community to be all the people who speak Barada, or are we considering it to be, well, okay, this Barada man lives with a Yolngu woman, they speak every day. Do they form a speech community? He speaks to her more often than he speaks to, the other Barada speakers down the road. So it's a really tricky one actually in a multilingual community to decide how you're doing that. And there's definitely a sense in which that second definition, so group of people who interact using speech, it is a relevant level that we want to consider because there are rules of use of language, again, another quote from Michael Silverstein, that kind of determines the sort of circulation of social understandings of language or how norms emerge. So we see, for example, similar ways of dividing up a language into dialects across 5 different languages in the same region, for example. So different things like that. We want to think about these different levels, or is it some kind of conflation of the two? Well, let's look at what Michael Walsh suggests, so and some others. So in his chapter, I think it is, entitled How Many Australian Languages Were There, I think, he notes that pre-colonially there were quite fine-grained systems of reference to language varieties. So talking about those levels of granularity, generally speaking, I guess you could say that Indigenous Australians tended to be sort of splitters rather than lumpers, would be one way to kind of phrase it. More recently, we see more of a lean towards, I guess, lumping in some places in terms of combining what might have been pre-colonially perceived to be many groups into one, say under the umbrella of a language name like Barada, for example. And I guess that's a sort of type of strategic essentialism where it might be useful for say, land rights or something like that for all these groups to kind of band together and unite under one particular identity, for example. And so here, Michael Walsh talks about the diversity of strategies, some of which are still evident, and the fact that there are new strategies that are sort of emerging. And he suggests this split. So if you've got language, a language name that seems to line up with what linguists would consider a language, we could call that language one. However, if you've got what is understood to be a language, which might be considered by linguists to be a dialect or some kind of regional variety, we can call that language two. Oh no, not regional variety, sorry, just a named dialect, language two. Regional geographical dialects, he labels languages 1A, and other named varieties, so perhaps something like a sociolect. So we might take the example of Dual versus Duwala in Eastern Arnhem Land. That would be labelled, I believe, languages 1B. So, you know, there's tools out there for distinguishing different levels at which these things get named. Might be useful to pull those apart somewhat in the context that you're looking at. So local perspectives might reveal more fine-grained perspective on variation. So if you ask locals, you might end up with quite a nuanced local system. And that might be different perhaps from what's been described, say, in the literature or something. I think I've given these examples already, but we can see the distinction between the Dual and the Duala varieties, understood by many to be distinct languages, but really just differing in that sort of whether that final vowel is present or absent in certain lexemes. Just some more complexities because, you know, we love it. This is a quote from Nick Evans, which talks about the level at which things like subsection terminology and moiety lex can operate. So he notes that it's not just at the level of one language, it can be at the level of a multilingual speech community that these things operate. So it's a really relevant level at which to think about. So this could be a language ecology or a regional system, as Ruth talked about before. Okay, so this is a key concept that might have come out already, but I'm not sure. If it hasn't, it's worth repeating. Shared language does not necessarily make a unity of different groups in the Northern Australian context. So language differences are seen more to be internal to society. So there are other things like clan or moieties I've mentioned that might be more salient. So the key here being that language is actually not necessarily the primary index for social identity. And this is something that has misled many a researcher in the past. And it's quite a difficult one to sort of untether yourself from. Okay. I might pause there just to check out. Ruth, do I need to look at any of these questions? What's been going on?
There has been some interesting discussion, but I think you don't probably need to address them.
All right, I'll have a look.
Especially,
at the end.
one you might want to talk about, which I gave my answer, was how do you transcribe recordings with so many languages? Do you have to work with different people or just one multilingual person?
Oh, imagine that. That would be great. Imagine if you had just one person who could do it all. Yeah, you have to work with a lot of different people. And I think probably the answer is badly for me, and hopefully better than I used to is the answer. But yeah, it's really difficult. It takes a hell of a lot of time and a lot of working with different people to triangulate the skills. But it's very slow. In the Maningrida context particularly. So a project we've been doing recently, which features 5 or 6 languages, sometimes you can get to the level of really doing a nice full transcription, and sometimes it's more of a translation. So you might just have to be sort of happy with, depending on what the outcome is. For those purposes, for subtitling videos, the translation is fine, but ideally you want transcription. So yeah, it's hard work to find the right people and to find the time. Yep.
When I started my work on multilingualism at Warruwi, I had a plan to learn to speak Gunwingu and Yulgamata.
Yeah, do that.
As well as Maung, and just work with those languages. But it turned out collaboration was actually a much better option.
Amazingly. Okay, so how are we doing for time? All right, okay. Well, look, I'll just quickly whiz through a little bit of a case study in language naming. And now someone, I think it was one of the Eleanors, is working on Biningunwak, so you're probably much more au fait with this stuff than I am. But let's sort of, I guess, pretend that we're tasked with you know, you've arrived in Western Arnhem Land and you're trying to get your head around the different varieties of Biningunwak and how you should record them in your notes. And you're talking to people from across the region. And this work, I should say, is mainly from Murray Gard, who has a long history in that region, also a little bit from Nick Evans and his work on Biningunwak. But yeah, mainly from Murray, and a plug for our apparently forthcoming article on language naming, which features some of this stuff with him as well. Okay, so Biningunwak is a series of dialects, really, an umbrella term. About 1,200 speakers in total, spread across a bunch of different sub-varieties. The biggest one is Gunwingu, centered at Gumbalanya, which has the majority of the speakers. It seems that Gunwingu's fortunes kind of rose around the mission time, when the mission policy promoted Gunwingu in some way, and that then became a little bit of a lingua franca, I guess you could say. So we saw at that time shifts from other varieties like Gunjetnyetmi and Gunjetmi to Gunwingu. But there's also Guningu without the W. That's the variety of Biningunwak that is spoken mostly at Maningrida, although Gune is there as well. And as I mentioned before, it's a common L2 for some other groups in Maningrida, one of the larger groups there. Gune is another variety. Gune I encounter mostly as the language that people who were understood to be Rembaranga speakers traditionally now often speak Gune at Maningrida and outstations. Then there's Gunjetmi and Gunjetnyetmi, very small, just a few elderly women around sort of Gumbalanya, and then Miley, which is further south, maybe a couple of dozen speakers at places like Manyalaluk and Pine Creek. So now that I've told you about those labels, I'm about to throw them all out the window. So I'll talk you through what I've got here. I'm going to use coloured circles because it's a Saturday afternoon and I feel like that's where all our brains are at. So here you can see a bunch of, so those variety labels that I just mentioned, plus a couple of others. So we've got Gunwingu, that's the big one, top left. Guningu, the Maningrida one in mint green. Gunjetmi and Gunjetnyetmi in the middle there. Gune out on the right. And then two varieties of Miley, that's that southern one, from two that label with different community names. So Bulkjum, which is an outstation, and Manyalaluk. Okay, so what we're doing now is we're going to go and chat to a Gunwingu speaker. So over at Gumbalanya, we're going to ask the Gunwingu speaker to tell us about the other varieties of Biningunwak and what she calls those varieties, okay? Hopefully you're with me. So a Gunwingu speaker typically will recognize not very much variation in the Biningunwak space. So all those circles that have been coloured orange are labelled in some way as basically just Gunwingu. So the only variety that a Gunwingu speaker will recognise as different is Gunjetmi and sometimes Gunjetnyetmi. But all the other ones, the Guningu, the Gune and the Miley, they're all just Gunwingu. They're Gunwingu that's spoken over there. Maybe it's a bit wrong, that Guningu, but it's still Guningu. So as we'll see in a moment, there's some erasure of the variation going on from this perspective. However, if we go and talk to a Gunjetmi speaker, so this is now very small speaker base, a Gunjetmi speaker will see quite a lot of variation. So there's a few that we don't have information for, but we'll recognise Gunwingu, we'll recognise Guningu, but give it a slightly different name. We'll recognise Miley and we'll recognise Gunjetnyetmi as distinct varieties. And we'll also have some other terms, of course, for referring to their own variety. All right, so you get the idea now. So we'll just kind of whiz through these. We ask a Miley speaker. They recognise commonalities with a whole bunch of the other varieties and call them some kind of Miley or Buboyan, which is another label for that variety, but acknowledge that Gunwingu is different and Gunjetmi is a little bit different and Gune is a little bit different, but seeing commonalities in a very different split to the others. Gune, something different again, seeing a lot of variation, but a different combination of commonalities recognized between Gune and some other varieties. Gunjetnyetmi, something different again, grouping one of the Myles together with Gune. So lots of stuff going on, and a different thing again from the other Myles speaker. So hopefully you get the idea. I imagine if you were, you know, actually trying to do this at this point, your head would have exploded. I think the only way Murray's gotten his head around it is from very, very long-term work in the region. But really, this is sort of by way of a cautionary tale of sorts against making any kind of assumptions about how particular language labels, you know, exist across settings, and a cautionary tale against bringing any sort of ideologies of connections between language and ethnicity or nation state type ideologies with you when you're trying to do this kind of work. So this is the kind of complexity that might in fact lurk underneath. So what we're seeing here is a range of conflicting perspectives on how the Beningumwok space is divided up. So we see erasure, so to borrow a term from Irving and Gall, so a process in which ideology in simplifying the field renders some people or varieties invisible. And we also see what Murray terms Ausbau. So this is kind of where you get intentional linguistic differentiation between groups that are understood to be different, just to sort of shore up that difference by recruiting language to the tool set, I guess. And both of these processes are often described at the sort of nation state level. So it's kind of what nation states do with language, but we also see this operating at the very local level within small scale multilingual contexts as well, and in other places. So just quickly then, before we do a little activity, some challenges in encountering languages then involve navigating with the baggage of linguistic nationalism. So we have all these expectations that are not, kind of can mislead us in when we're trying to describe things. Some useful concepts are the idea of the doculect. So this is an artifact of when a language has been documented by a linguist or a missionary, whoever, and maybe a dictionary has been put together or a grammar or something. So this doculect is actually an artificial construct. It's just a result of whoever was involved in the documentation process, but might not necessarily represent the true diversity or whatever about the language as it exists on the ground. And it might just be that it's been recognised by virtue of being in a dictionary or a grammar. And then I think a good place to end is from this quote from Donald Thompson, who talks about his work in Arnhem Land and says, "I've spent days, even weeks, off and on in investigations of social groups that lead nowhere." So, you know, hopefully that won't be the case for you, but hopefully there's some pointers there about how you might be able to avoid that. Okay, any questions, Ruth, from the chat before we go and do our activity?
There's one that I just answered in a confusing way that was about from Chloe about Ausbau and fractal recursivity. So I said I think Ausbau, but I didn't mention the word Ausbau, which was confusing, is intentional, maybe.
Yeah, my understanding of fractal I think they're related. I don't think they're sort of, you know, necessarily very different things, but I think Ausbau is traditionally used at the sort of nation state level. Fractal recursivity is, I think, where you get sort of reflexes of some perceived division across different systems, be it language, be it clothing, how you dress, how you divide up. You know, it's sort of kind of a perceived division, but that's kind of recursively reflected in different domains, I guess, is my understanding at least. And then Ausbau is kind of, I don't know, I guess, yeah, the example that Murray gives, you know, the clanlectal interjections, things like that, where, you know, it's like the knights who say ni, I guess. Is that a very niche reference? Maybe. Monty Python thing. Anyway, basically, you know, we're the group who says, hey, at the end of a sentence. That's kind of Ausbau. But it is a type of fractal recursivity, absolutely. It's just a sort of, I guess, a specific kind where language practice is recruited. Yep. Okay. All right, so I think it's time to break up into groups of maybe 3 or 4. I think we all have such rich and interesting backgrounds and kind of research projects that hopefully we can even just skip that first bit. I was thinking maybe we'd practice a little bit by talking about Australian English, but I think you all have an interesting language or multilingual ecology that you can kind of try this out on. So we're just revisiting the stuff that we've talked about, really. I want you to consider a multilingual ecology or a language that you know well. And in your group, have a think about some of the language ideologies that pertain to that variety. What do people say about it? What do people accept as truth about that variety and how it should be used and how it sort of sits in balance with other varieties? And do language practices that you have observed align or diverge from those ideologies? What kind of variations exist? And then related, move on to the idea of social categories. So thinking about those traditional social categories from that early work, class, age, ethnicity, and so on, do they work for this community that you know? Or are there other categories that you know to be locally salient and that might provide a sort of hook for important local language practices? If you're a community member, which of those social categories feel particularly salient for you and do they align with those standard ones? Really interesting. Okay, well, let's quickly just do the sort of summing up and then we'll hopefully leave a little bit more time for more discussion at the end. So just share slides again. So we wanted to sort of end on what essentially was drawing together stuff that we've talked about, but also left you with some hopefully useful tips and pointers and things to sort of beware of on your journey in describing multilingualism and multilingual contexts. So something that we've beaten the drum about quite a lot is that you want to be aware of imposing structures and understandings that that come from the role of languages in other communities, be that from what you've understood from the literature, descriptions of perhaps more Western settings, or how multilingualism exists within hierarchical nation states, for example, that can really lead you astray. But it's also the case that, you know, one small scale multilingual context to the next is going to be completely different and have different systems and ideologies supporting it. And as we've said, so this work really ought to be based in solid ethnographic work. It's not something that, you know, differently to perhaps doing so other kinds of linguistic research where you are able to go in and do a short-term data collection and come out again. This is something that actually rewards really long, in-depth and embedded work, and it should be ongoing, should be open to new realizations. So you never really want to make your mind up about what you've discovered. Working with speakers as collaborators, not as subjects. We've talked about that a lot. And in terms of methodologies, one way to think about what could be useful is a sort of combined bottom-up and top-down approach. So that might look like something we could think about collecting a corpus, collecting examples of multilingual practices from across different settings, from at home, from around the community, and putting it together in a corpus, and then examining the corpus and having the multilingual practices of interest emerge from that corpus. We can see that as a sort of a bottom-up approach, but we can also combine that with the more, I guess we could think of it as top-down ethnographic approaches where you're delineating the social space at the same time. So figuring out what those locally salient categories are. Various methods are useful here. The language portraits we've talked about. Language portraits as a sort of window into linguistic biographies, so people's personal linguistic histories. Figuring out ways to get at ideologies. Mapping tasks can be really useful to get people to talk about where languages exist and where speakers are. And the idea being that those salient categories that we're after emerge more organically. And then hopefully we meet somewhere in the middle between the corpus and these other methods. And then we can kind of check our findings by things like perhaps eliciting a particular, might be in variationist work, a particular variable, talking about them, getting some commentary about practices that we're interested in, and looking at communities within communities. So communities of practice and particular networks and things, they might sit somewhere in the middle. If you're a more visual person, this is pretty much what that might look like in a chart. So you've got corpora and things like mapping tasks and interviews feeding into the way we identify what practices we're interested in, but also those salient categories. And then checking on these by more targeted approaches and discussion with people. And then hopefully what you end up with is some evaluation of these language practices, description of what they look like and what they mean in terms of their socio-indexical values. Some things to be beware of, I guess. So balancing what we know in inverted commas about long-standing practices. So in the Australian context, there's been so much written about language practices that it can be easy to go in and expect certain things to look a certain way. But of course, these are very dynamic practices, ever evolving, new categories emerging, new ways of making social meaning, new priorities and so on, new mobilities. And so acknowledging that these formations evolve and that new categories are going to become more salient is really important. We don't want to risk fossilizing or reifying what are really dynamic processes, and that can be a really tricky balance to strike. And of course, if you're doing something like writing a dictionary, that's just something that you kind of have to embrace and do the best you can with. And then, of course, attending to both ideologies, they're very important, but they are not practices. So you want to have a combined approach there. Perhaps can be useful to think about kinship and marriage models in the Australian context. So you've got these kind of articulated schemas that perhaps guide and shape practices in some ways, but they're not actually the reality of what relationships do look like. So perhaps that's a sort of parallel phenomenon, I guess. Some other practical issues in the Northern Australian context, at least, I imagine many of the contexts you're all working in, small corpora, just a tricky thing, really low frequency of phenomena. So small corpus means you might just not be able to have many examples of a thing you're interested in. Fewer speakers representing fewer social categories. This is some of these issues more so within a variationist study, but also the case in multilingualism as well. So some ways to get around this are to perhaps do some more targeted data collection. So focusing in on some kind of subsection of the community, be that children or older speakers or a subculture. Long-term data collection, if you can get the funding and have a job, you know, that's a good thing to do. But whatever you can manage, I guess, within the reality of the job market at the moment, certainly something overhanging all of these pieces of advice, including a battery of approaches. So as I've said, corpora, elicitation, biographies, interviews, all of that kind of thing. And really, most importantly, I think a collaborative approach. And if you can swing at a team-based approach, I think Ruth and her colleagues are a really great example of how a team-based approach can lead to really fruitful outcomes that are really satisfying for the community, but also mutually beneficial for all the researchers involved. A small note about that comes up with multilingualism a lot, I think, and this ideology that you don't mix languages. It's a bit of a tricky thing in Maningrida when I tell people that I'm just really interested in people mixing languages and, you know, people using languages that maybe aren't their main language and stuff like that, and how young people use language. So for me, I've had to also combine it with working with older speakers and doing more traditional language documentation, because that's really what the community is more interested in seeing. So I think it can often be the case that you need to engage in a little bit of negotiation to figure out how best to serve the needs of the community, as well as perhaps looking at what you're interested in. Hopefully some kind of happy medium can be come at so that everyone's is pleased with the research itself and then the outcomes. Okay, so just by way of reminding you of what we covered, I won't go through it all, but maybe it'll jar some questions that you had from earlier on that you now would like to ask. I'll leave that with you for a moment if you've got any questions, and I'll just mention that there's some suggested literature that could be useful. So some very recent articles by Pierpaolo De Carlo and colleagues looking at methodologies for documenting small-scale multilingualism, which I think is a gap that really needed to be filled. So that's a really useful addition to the literature. A recent paper by Brigitte Packendorf and colleagues looking at the typology of small-scale multilingualism, a plug for Ruth's forthcoming chapter looking at linguistic biographies and portraits, and again, that 2018 special issue that I mentioned before. If you don't want to read anything and, you know, want to hear us talk more, I can't imagine you would at this point. You probably need a bit of a break, but we had a panel on small-scale multilingualism in the Pacific space, the Ilara series. There's also one on some small-scale multilingual contexts on the Atlantic as well. So really interesting researchers involved in that. Some other links to talks and some other people talking about similar things, and a podcast also that you might find interesting.